Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our very own research associate, Dr. Amanda Turnbull. So Dr. Turnbull is a lecturer in law at Te Piringa, the Faculty of Law at the University of Waikato. Her research focuses on law and technology, specifically how we're adapting to the algorithmic turn in society. So that's where algorithms are becoming the main mediator through which power is carried out. Amanda is a cross-disciplinary scholar, so she's committed to fostering dynamic thinking in our increasingly complex and globalized world, where legal problems are becoming much more than problems about law. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to all of you who have joined today to hear this talk about on-demand bias in the ride-sharing industry. So special thanks to Dr. April Jolie-Simpson and to Puna Haumaru for giving me this opportunity and inviting me to give this talk to you and making all the arrangements for it. So before I begin this talk today, I'm just going to give a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that I am going to be discussing sexual violence, so I just want to let everyone who's online know that it can be a difficult subject. If it is difficult for you, feel free to pause and take a breather, or just shut off and watch this either a later time or jump back into the discussion if you can. And then secondly, while I'll undertake a critical discussion about ride-sharing, it's not to say that there are no benefits from ride-sharing technology. I mean, I use it occasionally. It's convenient. I know a lot of people enjoy supplementing their income as ride-share workers. And I expect at the end of, for example, an Uber ride, very few of us would ever state, gosh, I wish I had taken a taxi instead. So, and the same disclaimer applies more generally to technology. I don't think I could exist very well anymore without the technologies that I've come to depend on each day. So this talk is given with the best interest, with the best intention, and ultimately it's intended to contribute to conversations about keeping AI and technology sustainable as we move ahead in society with adopting it increasingly. So ride sharing. So ride sharing can be defined as the act of requesting a car and driver to take you to a specific location. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the largest and most popular ride-sharing platforms include Uber, Didi, and Your Ride, with Uber occupying about 80% of the market. So that's Ministry of Transport 2023 stats. So ride-sharing has revolutionized the public transportation and ease of travel through on-demand apps that prioritize customers and ratings. It's not, however, without its controversy. So since Uber does occupy the lion's share of the market, I'm going to use Uber as examples. So for instance, Uber has had its share of crises that stem from regulatory issues, labor relations controversies, financial instability, intellectual property problems, to workplace sexual harassment concerns, and a deluge of lawsuits from drivers, passengers, and governments alike. Adding to this tally of troubles, Uber has also endured backlash through social media activism, such as France's hashtag #UberSayOver hashtag, which appeared on X and revealed stark accounts of sexual violence perpetrated by Uber drivers, or the hashtag #DeleteUber that arose when Uber allegedly took advantage of a taxi strike at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York following the first Trump administration's immigration ban. And then hashtag delete Uber resurfaced following the publication of Susan Fowler's blog in 2017, in which she detailed the sexual harassment she endured while working at Uber as a site reliability engineer. So what's becoming increasingly evident is that this ride-sharing industry promises flexibility, but there's a growing research that with this ostensible flexibility, we're subjected to increasing technologically facilitated harm. And these harms include bias, gender-based harassment, inadequate protection of workers' health, safety issues, coercive control, and a gendered pay gap. So I just thought before kind of moving to the more particularized aspects that I want to discuss today, that I would discuss some stories of increasing tech-facilitated harm, where we can see that we're moving from kind of a broader societal concern to one that is more particularized. So here are a few examples, as I said, involving tech-facilitated safety issues, bias, and sexual violence. So during the London Bridge attack in the UK in 2017, a van drove into pedestrians walking on the sidewalk of the bridge. The van then continued on and crashed into a nearby pub, where the individuals in the van exited the vehicle with knives taped to their wrists and fake bombs strapped on their bodies. So they ran through the market area, randomly attacking those who came into their path. And as this crisis unfolded, people were trying to leave. And they were trying to leave as quickly as they could, and this included trying to hire an Uber to safely leave the area. Uber's dynamic pricing algorithm, however, caused rates to jump more than 200% during the first 45 minutes of this crisis. So this makes little sense. Uber admits that its pricing algorithm predicts peak timings like rush hours and busy times like Fridays and Saturdays, or kind of like festival times, based on areas that people are in. But this was an issue of safety and not related to any of these other reasons. In a more particularized gendered story, on March 31st in 2019, a woman in New Jersey did not expect that her Uber driver would invite her out for a coffee or a glass of wine at the end of her short trip that she would otherwise have walked had it not been raining that day. Nor did she expect the driver to return to her home uninvited and leave a letter at her door later that evening, inviting her out again. The following day, the driver was waiting in his car when she went to take her dog for a walk, alleging that he was simply in her neighborhood. She reported him to Uber. She heard nothing back. 2 days later, he was waiting for her where she normally walked her dog in the park. She called the police. The driver admitted to waiting for her, and she was advised to file a restraining order. By the end of the week, she was no longer sleeping at home for fear he would appear when she least expected it. She filed a harassment prevention order, so this is in the US, as a temporary solution. 2 weeks later, she had to appear in court to make it permanent, and this order was granted, but just for 1 year. In another story in 2015, 2 male passengers attacked a driver this time, so this is the driver being attacked, in a fit of homophobic fury. So the driver was lesbian, and she was verbally and physically attacked. She suffered bodily injury, including 2 cracked front teeth. She reported the incident to San Diego police, but Uber would not disclose the identity of the passenger without a subpoena. She was told the police detective was unable to get one without evidence beyond her testimony, so her case was inactivated. Uber informed her that she would not have to worry about being paired with the passenger who booked the ride in the future, but at the same time, they would not confirm if this passenger was banned generally to everyone or just to her. And finally, in one other case, in which a sexual offender became a rideshare driver in order to further their means of sexual violence. So this story that I'm telling here occurred in 2016. An Uber driver in San Diego sexually assaulted an inebriated woman when she was returning home from a first date. The woman reported the attack to police after she managed to escape his vehicle. And this led to the discovery of as many as 14 other sexual assaults prior to becoming an Uber driver. The driver had also kept videos documenting this abuse. The women survivors of this abuse ranged in age from 13 to 21. He had drugged many of them, and some of the survivors were not even aware that they had been sexually assaulted until they were told in the course of this investigation. So this particular driver was found guilty of rape, along with 33 other counts of sexual assault against women and children. What these stories demonstrate is that ride-sharing creates safety issues generally, but that it has also become a vehicle for a more particularized and now internationally recognized issue of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So I'm just going to shorten that phrase slightly because it is quite a mouthful to TFGBV. So TFGBV arises out of misogyny, sexist norms, and rape culture. All of these things existed long before the internet. It's a furtherance of gender-based violence that affects almost 750 million women worldwide, which is effectively what we would call a global emergency. TFGBV is a metamorphosis of the offline intersecting systems of oppression in society, and these include sexism, racism, colonialism, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia. In other words, technology functions as a means of perpetuating but also amplifying existing forms of gender-based violence. So the term TFGBV is replacing other language such as cyberstalking to avoid the kind of artificial chasm between the offline and the online spheres. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, technology-facilitated gender-based violence is an unmapped area. Lawmakers and the public have yet to come to terms with whether or not tech-facilitated behaviours are in fact forms of violence. Although we do have a small number of scholars working on it, as well as emerging scholars. So I have one of my students, my new PhD students, I believe I saw her online, Yaji Yin. She's working at Waikato on her PhD project, which looks at the ramifications of TFGBV as these survivors move back into the offline sphere. So along with the shortfall of not recognizing TFGBV, there's a general lack of data about the gig economy in New Zealand, and this is particularly problematic, for women in the ride-sharing industry. So we talk a lot about the gig economy, like in our everyday speech, but what exactly does it involve? Broadly speaking, the gig economy refers to a move away from the standard employment relationship towards more flexibility, such as contract work, contingent work, and freelancing. More recently, the definition has narrowed to encompass work that's mediated by digital labor platforms. So basically, the digital platforms often replace what we would have called the middleman with an algorithm. And these algorithms are often thought of as being agnostic or being neutral that help customers find products or services and source the relevant gig worker to do so. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, no specific data on the gig economy is collected, though at least one study to date has been done on how it could be measured. So that study has been done by Motu Economic and Public Policy Research in 2019. Stats New Zealand currently considers gig work in the category of those who are self-employed without employees, along with people who start their own businesses, freelancers, and also independent contractors. So the gig economy, it's not particularized in how we understand our statistics. We do know that as of March 2021, there was a total rise in this self-employed individuals without employees of 7.5% in New Zealand, and that self-employed women without employees increased by 14%. Australia, by comparison, has begun to deal with improving statistics on new and emerging forms of employment, including digital platform workers. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics developed an initial framework to measure digital platform work and workers during the 22-23 financial year. And then they expanded this framework for the 23-24 year. And the results they found were like those in other OECD countries. So the majority of digital platform workers were male, and there was a larger portion of individuals between the ages of 25 and 34 working in the digital platform economy than the total employed population. So we could say that the available data on the gig economy in Oceania is kind of fledgling, but it does reveal that Australia has undertaken more specific analysis of the area, and also that in both Australia and New Zealand, the gig economy is expanding rapidly. Now, this expansion, this is seen in other places around the world. This is partly due to the ease in becoming a gig worker, but also as a result of other externalities such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The number of platforms has also grown exponentially in the last decade, so something like 142 to more than 777 globally. So this is a statistic taken from the International Labour Organization. And we can expect that in this current economic climate, the number of gig workers will only continue to grow. So gig platform work has a low entry barrier, and it's often pitched as flexible, allowing for a more kind of work-life balance and scheduling versatility. There's also the allure of ostensible entrepreneurship and what could be deemed a powerful myth that workers are their own boss. Platform workers, in reality, are increasingly managed by algorithmic means. They are subject to consumer-sourced rating mechanisms and automated nudges, which have partly led to debates over employee classification, since control is exerted over the workforce, albeit through algorithmic means. Now, when it comes to scrutinizing the gig economy, we've spent a lot of time discussing future of work issues, such as whether platform workers are entitled to employment standards, protections such as minimum wage or holiday pay, for example. Recent New Zealand Court of Appeal ride-sharing decisions substantiate this point. So what happened in the end of 2024 was that the Court of Appeal ruled that Uber drivers should be classified as employees rather than independent contractors. So if this decision of the Court of Appeal is allowed to stand, it means that drivers would no longer have the flexibility of using competing ride-sharing apps simultaneously to pick the best paying job. This is because as employees, drivers would have to select only one employer from which to be offered worker protections. And consequently, income opportunities may be reduced, and passengers may experience longer wait times and higher costs. So rather than waiting for Uber to appeal to the Supreme Court, so this is what's happened in other jurisdictions where these Uber cases and employment have gone to the court system, in the UK, for example, in Canada, and the US, the New Zealand government, however, has stepped in and proposed quick fix legislation that involves what they've called a gateway test to determine whether someone's a contractor or someone's an employee. So for gig workers who enjoy flexible arrangements and autonomy, this proposed employment legislation amendment is great, is advantageous. Australia, on the other hand, recently enacted what they've called the Fair Work Act in 2024, which introduced a new class of worker entitled employee-like worker. And then this classification covers many gig workers who would previously been classified as independent contractors. So notwithstanding this New Zealand proposed gateway test, many questions about the gig economy in Aotearoa, New Zealand remain answered. TFGBV is one. But things like how can job security be ensured? Does reduced job security and legal protections disproportionately impact Maori and Pacific peoples who have historically faced workforce inequality in New Zealand? How are gig workers guaranteed adequate pay? To what benefit? And also, as I've said, how do we deal with this increasing issue of technology-facilitated gender-based violence? In Aotearoa, New Zealand, just generally, a recent study of women gig workers, food delivery, and home service platforms finds that women experience harassment and develop response mechanisms to safeguard their ratings and future job prospects. Women are compelled to brush off bad customer ratings. So this is a problem. The design of apps affects egregious circumstances for women platform workers, permitting harassment with impunity. The experience of women gig workers, particularly in the ride-sharing industry, are further substantiated in safety reports. Uber, for example, reported almost 6,000 instances of sexual assault involving both drivers and passengers in 2019 in their first safety report, and almost 4,000 in its second report, which was in 2022. These reports were only issued in the US. Lyft, another competitor in the North American market, which has left New Zealand, it received more than 4,000 reports for the 2017 to 2019 time period for both women drivers and women passengers. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, none of the existing ride-sharing platforms make safety reports available. Further, the available ride-sharing case law in New Zealand focuses on driver perpetrators of sexual violence. So the most recent case is Wong and New Zealand Police from 2023. This may be evidence of underreporting in respect of women drivers, which may be the consequence of women sort of brushing off abuse in order to stay competitive as drivers, or of reporting being insufficiently corroborated by the platform itself. Ride-sharing platforms are known for protecting the privacy of the passengers over the drivers. Additionally, the New Zealand government has produced literature on the gig economy and road safety, but again here, the limited analysis about sexual violence is focused on sexual offences by gig drivers. There's also limited legislation, unanswered questions about protecting gig workers, possible underreporting of sexual harassment experienced by women, and evidence that the gig economy, in which ride sharing occupies a significant proportion, is projected to continue growing. All this demonstrates that there is a gender-based inequality gap in the ride-sharing industry that we need to know more about in New Zealand. So this brings me to the end of my PowerPoint. This point, great. And so what I'm proposing is that we need to gather more information about this issue of what I've called on-demand bias. We need to gather more literature on women as driver and their experiences in New Zealand. We need to look at more of the stories more generally around the world of women drivers and better understand the gig economy in New Zealand in order to better understand the impact on women drivers. So I think at this point, we should sort of stop, pause, and think about whether you have any questions at this point or any points that you would like to further elaborate or discuss.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for giving that overview.
Yeah.
It's definitely outside of my area, so I found it interesting to hear about. You talked about the need to essentially do a scoping exercise to get the lay of the land for how things are impacting in New Zealand and in this area. What have you seen from overseas in terms of how people have actually managed to do that research? Because it seems like the kind of thing that you only hear about maybe through the media, for example, when it goes very wrong. How is this research actually best done?
Well, I think first we need to know more about the gig economy, right? We need to not focus only on issues of employment and sort of pivot to the more particular issues that may be impacting workers' health, for example. Just there's insufficient information available statistically about the gig economy. So we need to kind of start there. We also need to recognize that technology facilitated gender-based violence is an actual harm that we should be concerned about, that maybe can't just be covered under existing sexual violence mechanisms in society. And we also need to think that, a lot of areas of law imagine technology as or imagine that we need to be neutral to technology, that we can just sort of adapt our old laws under the old information communications infrastructures like print. We can just adapt it to this new online environment. And I just don't see that as being realistic because, our technologies are not neutral to us. So how can we continue just to be neutral to them?
That's really interesting. It reminds me of some of the conversations that are being had specifically in the family violence area, where it's like some of our ways of understanding and measuring harm aren't accounting for harm, for example, or harmful messages or public shaming that can occur on social media and things like that that are absolutely ways that harm is committed, but not necessarily accounted for or taken that seriously, perhaps when reported. So it's interesting to see a similar thing in this space. I mean, it is the same issue that we're talking about, but that's just something that's a little bit more familiar to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that, the UN has recognized that TFGBV is a particular harm. It's not just sort of part of this broader violence against women, that in fact, that there's this much more narrow area that we need to pay attention to. So we're talking about it in the international sphere, but we're not yet kind of contemplating it in our more local laws. So it's kind of like every aspect that touches, sort of the intersecting interdisciplinary aspects that touch it all need more work, right? It's an area that there's not one answer to, that it's an intersecting, cross-cutting area that's understudied across the board.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
there's also an ethical concern at the computer science level, right, that we need to kind of pay attention to. So ride hailing came about as, let's hail a car with nothing but our cell phones. Well, okay, but how about let's hail a car safely with nothing but our cell phones, right? Also a case of, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
So you can see it creating opportunities for harm that aren't thought of, and that might not necessarily be malicious, but they should be thought of.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
TFGBV recognizes things like doxing and, particular online harms. But we've yet to map also the kind of offline ramifications, which I mentioned, and I see her name's there, Yaji.
Hmm.
Yaji is studying TFGBV in the context of New Zealand. We've yet to even think about or even start mapping the offline ramifications of, for example, doxing and all these online terrible things. We've yet to look at how these harms come back into, the offline world. Yes.
Clementine asks, what is your sense about to what extent drivers and customers understand what constitutes harm? Do they know it's harm and don't report, or are they unsure? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, Uber has begun to I'm using Uber here because, as I said before, they are the kind of the dominant market force, but they have begun to do sexual violence training for their drivers. They put in a sort of mini tutorial that all drivers now have to take at the outset of their um, sign up process, but they send it off to like RAIN is the organization in the US. They send it off to a third party uh, to undertake. So they offload it onto an organization that has previously existed and say, this is a bigger problem in the world, not just about ride hailing. And so you can watch this video. And so there is, to sort of touch on Clementine's question, there is some training being done now as a consequence of the reports that Uber has issued. There is some training being done for drivers, but to what extent does the general public understand it? Well, I mean, I'm not sure that they do. I know that, you see the cases of when sort of young women passengers are attacked. You see these in social media and in regular media when they occur. But to what extent, I'm not sure. I have statistics, but I don't think it's a well sort of established kind of conversation that we're yet having about the issues. I mean, we talk about it in children and using technology at school, but I don't think that we've kind of, as I've said in earlier in my talk, we haven't mapped out even in New Zealand the issue of TFGBV. So I think it's just all kind of up in the air, a
Yeah,
big question mark.
absolutely. And to throw another spanner in the works, another big question mark,
Yeah.
Devon Flashcheck says, hello, Amanda. Interesting talk for sure. Thank you for that. I'm not convinced that legislation is a very effective tool for preventing harm. I
Yeah.
wonder what thoughts you have had about other social or technology mechanisms, for example, in the case of ride sharing, that might make it safer for women drivers and passengers. So, for example, what could make phone use to summon a ride safer?
Yeah, I agree, Devin. Thank you for that question. I agree that legislation and law, they don't, they're not the be all and end all. I think as I said, it's a cross-cutting issue that, as society, we need to think about solutions. One of the things that, can we, sorry, back up. One of the questions that my PhD student Yaji is looking at is, is it possible to have kind of bystander, online bystander kind of apps? So is there a tech solution to this tech problem? Or indeed, is it an offline thing that we need to contemplate? Is it just more bystander training generally? Um, I don't have a good answer at this point. Where I'm at is that we need to better understand in order to come up with the solutions. So
Yeah.
until we can map out a little more of what this looks like in terms of actual evidence, the solutions are kind of.
To what extent do you think there is a responsibility for the actual service providers to be building this in at the front end? We kind of talked before about how when people design new products or new tech, they don't think about the potential
Yeah.
for misuse. To what extent should that actually be required? And is that something that legislation could help with? I mean, rather than necessarily criminal legislation about like the obligations and responsibilities that companies have.
So there's a couple of things. One is, ensuring that computer science students take an ethics course. I'm not sure worldwide how good a job we do at that, because the response by computer science scientists is that, this is a policy issue. This is not, a design issue. This is a policy issue of a company later on down the line. So it's kind of like, it all gets shoved off. I think it's a law issue. I think it's an ethics issue. The service provider, well, I mean, then you get into things like Uber doesn't even describe itself as a ride-sharing company. It describes itself as a tech company that offers the following services, right? So it circumvents having to deal with the employer contractor issue. So, I mean, everything's quite muddy. More, we need to know more at the front end, I think, in order to kind of address the issue. But I think also recognizing that we can't just be neutral to technology in law, that we need to recognize it's not neutral to us. So the idea that we can just it's just like paper is just folly, right?
Yeah.
You could replace an email signature with a handwritten signature, but that's not the same thing when it comes to the kind of harms experienced by women in technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming from my disciplinary background, where I'm really interested in the behavior of specific offenders who choose to commit crime, I'm interested, and I appreciate that you might well not have the answer to this, but I'm interested in what you think about to what extent technology is unlocking new harm, TB
TFGBV.
TFGBV
Yeah.
versus creating opportunities or facilitating the actions of people who might be motivated to take up opportunities that present themselves online or offline.
Yeah. I mean, that is the kind of the story about the Uber drivers, that they're not sufficiently they're not subject to the same restrictions as employees, right? So previously, criminal law checks weren't done before you became an Uber driver, right? So it just enables malicious bad actors in society to perpetrate their harms in other ways. Which is another kind of back to my point about we can't be neutral to these technologies, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
This has really prompted my thinking because a lot of the critiques actually that you've had today about don't just think of technology harm as something tacked on at the end. It can be its own thing. That is how I was thinking. So it is good to
Yeah.
be prompted to think of this as its kind of own area to be considered, and that the impacts might not necessarily translate just because the acts might look roughly analogous to something that happens out there in the world. So that example of the messages versus letters, things like that, the impact could still be really different.
Yeah, and what's more is now that we're looking at generative AI is becoming like foundation models. So we have, you can just imagine, right? We have this, we're identifying this area of TFGBV, and now we're handing over, designing apps and designing technology to AI itself as being the root rather than the human being being the root. Is that what is that going to do to the area of TFGBV that we don't even recognize yet, right?
Yeah.
It's like it becomes a super kind of version of, or I've argued elsewhere, it's sort of ecosystemic technology facilitated gender-based violence.
Yeah. It's quite a scary rabbit hole to go down
It
thinking about
is.
that. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well,
So I guess it might, to kind of sum things up, it's an understudied area. It's often a kind of expression we often use in law is more needs to be done, is that we need to do more in this area. We need more fact finding at the outset in order to address it, whether it's through law or whether it's societal means. We just need to know more. And we need to, kind of take our heads out of the sand and think beyond the gig economy issues being about employee employer protections, right? There's much more to this issue of the gig economy than just whether or not you're entitled to minimum wage or holiday pay.
yeah, absolutely. That's really insightful. It's given me a lot to think about. So much. Thank you so much for sharing today with us, Amanda.
Thank you. Yeah.